I still remember the sound. That sharp, awful crack that seemed to silence the entire street, even as a band played just a few feet away and the children in the school parade marched on in rhythmic innocence. I was clapping just a moment before, cheering for my little girl, when the world froze around me. My daughter Emma, who had been so proudly moving along the route with her tiny American flag in hand and a determined smile spread across her face, suddenly collapsed to the pavement, her face contorted in pain and confusion. Her crutches, pink, glittered and custom-made with extra foam padding and stickers of unicorns and shooting stars, were no longer beneath her arms. One had been yanked away, broken clean in half like a stick, and discarded like garbage on the sidewalk. The other lay beside her, dropped when she lost her balance. She hit the ground hard, and my heart hit it even harder. Emma is only 9, but she's tougher than most adults I know. Born with cerebral palsy, she's had to fight for every step she takes, every small victory, every smile. But you'd never know it if you saw her. She beams brighter than the sun when she feels seen, when she's part of something bigger than herself. This parade had meant the world to her. For months, she had practiced walking on her crutches, just a bit further every day, just so she could keep up with the other kids. She had watched the videos of past parades and dreamed of waving her flag and showing her school spirit. It was supposed to be her moment, a celebration of her effort, her resilience, her pride in being able to walk, even if it was with the help of pink aluminum poles. But someone took that moment from her. Not by accident, not through some tragic twist of fate. No, this was deliberate, calculated, cruel. A woman, probably in her mid-50s, tall and thin with bottle blonde hair, styled in that aggressive HOA bob cut, had stormed over to where we were waiting with the parade group just minutes before they began marching. She wore oversized sunglasses and a beige power-walking tracksuit, and her entire posture oozed disdain. She didn't look at Emma like she was a child, or even a person, just an inconvenience. "Those crutches are a tripping hazard," she barked, her voice sharp and nasal like nails on glass. "You people really think this is safe? I'm reporting this to the HOA. This is a liability and I won't have it ruining the parade." I blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "Excuse me?" I said, already stepping forward to shield Emma. But I wasn't fast enough. She didn't wait for a conversation. Without warning, she lunged forward and grabbed one of Emma's crutches. Emma shrieked, not with sound, because the pain made it stick in her throat. But her eyes widened, her mouth opened, and her whole body twisted in panic. Before I could grab the woman's wrist, she swung the crutch down hard against the sidewalk. The crack echoed. Emma's knees buckled and she dropped like a rag doll. I dove to catch her, but she was already on the pavement, her palms scraped and her cheeks smudged with dirt. The crowd around us gasped. Kids stopped walking. A few parents rushed forward. But the woman just huffed, dusted her hands off like she had just done some necessary chore and turned on her heel. "This is exactly why the rules matter," she muttered as she walked away, not even bothering to glance back at my daughter trembling on the ground. My fists clenched so tightly my knuckles went white. I wanted to run after her, scream at her, do something. But all I could do in that moment was kneel beside Emma, lift her into my arms, and whisper softly, "I've got you, baby. Daddy's here." She clung to me, her tiny hands shaking, her eyes welling up with tears, though she fought them like a soldier. I looked up at the crowd, and they looked away, awkward, uncomfortable, unsure of what they had just witnessed. A few parents murmured that it was unbelievable, disgusting, even insane. But no one stopped her. No one held her accountable. Not yet. And as I looked down at the broken crutch on the ground, the one I'd spent hours adjusting and reinforcing so that Emma would feel confident walking, I felt something shift in me. Something deep. Something dangerous. That woman had no idea who I was. She didn't recognize me in jeans and a flannel shirt. She didn't know my name, and she certainly didn't know my badge sat tucked in a drawer back home under a stack of old case files. I am the county sheriff. I've served 15 years. I've brought down drug rings, handled hostage negotiations, and stood face to face with violent criminals. But never, in all my years, have I felt the kind of white-hot rage that surged through me, watching a self-righteous neighborhood dictator assault a disabled child, my child, in front of an entire community and walk away like she'd just picked up litter. It wasn't just an attack on Emma's body. It was an attack on her dignity, her courage, her joy. And it was an attack on our family. That was the moment I decided. She messed with the wrong dad, the wrong girl, the wrong family. I held Emma close and whispered in her ear that everything would be okay. And I meant it. Because I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to let some HOA tyrant hide behind bureaucracy and rules while she terrorized good people under the guise of community standards. That day, as the parade resumed and someone offered Emma a small folding chair so she could at least wave her flag while seated, I made a silent vow. I would make her answer for what she did, and I wouldn't come after her as a neighbor or a father or just another victim of her petty cruelty. I'd come after her as a sheriff, with the full force of law, truth, and justice, because when someone shatters a little girl's crutches, they don't just break metal. They break something sacred. And that can't go unanswered. Living under the HOA had always felt a little like living under invisible surveillance. A quiet, creeping pressure that made neighbors glance over their shoulders before setting out a lawn chair or planting a flower 2 inches too close to the sidewalk. But until the day Karen broke my daughter's crutch and her spirit in front of an entire school parade, I hadn't fully grasped just how deep her control ran. Karen wasn't just an HOA president, she was a dictator draped in khaki. For 5 years, she'd held her position like a throne, wielding rules like weapons and turning what should have been a community into a kingdom of fear. She fined residents for decorative violations like mismatched curtains or bird feeders hung from non-regulation hooks. My wife once got a written warning for parking her car, a perfectly legal vehicle, too close to our own driveway because its paint looked slightly oxidized. And she came after me once for leaving my trash bin out 10 minutes past the 8 a.m. collection time. 10 minutes. But I always told myself to breathe through it, to keep the peace. I didn't want to be the sheriff in my own neighborhood. My badge stayed locked away at home. Not because I was ashamed, but because I believed there should be a difference between law and personal life. I thought I could be just another neighbor, another dad, just a man trying to raise his family, without conflict. But after what she did to Emma, yanking away a disabled child's crutch and leaving her to collapse in front of a crowd, then strutting off like she'd done the community a favor, that illusion shattered. I couldn't look the other way anymore. The very next morning, after making sure Emma was resting comfortably at home with her mother, I drove down to the school and requested access to the security and traffic camera footage from the parade route. The principal was more than cooperative, clearly shaken by what had happened. And within minutes, I had it queued up on a monitor in the office. There she was, Karen, marching up in her beige tracksuit, those ridiculous oversized sunglasses sitting on the bridge of her nose like a mask of power. She didn't hesitate, just lunged forward, ripped the crutch away from Emma, and smashed it on the sidewalk without blinking. And then, even worse, she smiled. A smirk, like she had done something noble. I took that footage and downloaded it to a secure drive, feeling the lawman in me fully awaken. But I wasn't done. I needed to understand who I was up against, and more importantly, how deep the rot went. So I visited the HOA office, posing as a concerned resident wanting to file a complaint about parade safety and event protocols. The receptionist, an elderly woman named Sharon, who always smiled a little too tightly, waved me in and offered a clipboard. I sat down, but I wasn't there to write anything. I listened. The office was quiet but not silent, and through the thin wall just beyond the reception desk, I could hear voices. Karen's voice was unmistakable, sharp, smug, and dripping with authority. "You should have seen his face," she was saying. "Like I'd just kicked a puppy. Honestly, if you ask me, the kid shouldn't have been in the parade at all. It's not a pity party." Another woman chuckled. "What's her name again?" Karen replied without hesitation. "Emma. I just call her Limp Girl. Everyone in the group does. She's been begging for attention since they moved in." Laughter, actual laughter, and then something that made my skin go cold. One of the other voices said, "We should keep track of them, make sure they know we're watching. The HOA's got standards." They weren't just cruel. They were organized, targeted, strategic. That's when I realized this wasn't just about one incident or one crutch. This was a pattern. A system. Karen had created a private group chat with a circle of other board members, and not all just her inner circle, and used it to mock residents, to plan fines in advance, to selectively enforce rules against the families they didn't like. And they especially didn't like families that challenged her control, families that looked different, spoke up, or didn't fit her beige-tinted vision of proper. I left that office burning, not with blind rage, but with focus. Precision. My instincts, sharpened from years of building cases and breaking down criminal networks, kicked in. This wasn't a homeowner's issue anymore. This was systemic harassment, discrimination, abuse of power, possibly even federal violations under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. I went home, sat down at my kitchen table, and for the first time in 5 years, I pulled my badge and my service weapon from the locked drawer. I looked at both of them. And then I looked at a picture of Emma on the fridge, her little smile shining through last year's school photo, her crutches standing proudly beside her like trophies of battle. That's when I knew. I wasn't going to wait for karma. I wasn't going to post passive-aggressive comments on the neighborhood forum or hope some distant committee investigated the matter. No, I was going to bring the full weight of the law down on Karen and her corrupt little empire. I began documenting everything. I created a digital folder, time-stamped and encrypted. I listed every unfair fine we'd received, every complaint. From neighbors over the past 2 years, every voicemail, every HOA email. I reached out to neighbors privately, asking careful questions, gauging their experiences. At first, people were nervous. No one wants to be the first to speak up. But once I told them who I was, what I was, and the walls started to crack, people opened up. They shared screenshots, letters, warnings, photos. One family had been fined over 20 times in a single year, all for violations that were never enforced on other streets. Another mom said Karen had once implied her autistic son's sensory lights on their porch were disruptive and threatened to report them to child services if she didn't remove them. It was darker than I thought, bigger, deeper. This wasn't an HOA president enforcing community order. This was a tyrant using suburban law as a leash. And Emma, my brave, beautiful daughter, had become just another casualty in a long list of innocent people she trampled. That's when something inside me clicked. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. I wasn't even angry, not in the wild, helpless way I'd been after the parade. Now I was calm, focused, cold, because now I had something she didn't expect. Evidence, authority, and the truth on my side. I wasn't going to storm her house or yell in the street. I wasn't going to play her game. I was going to play mine. And Karen? She had no idea who she had provoked. I was done being passive, done being polite. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was about justice. And justice doesn't knock. It kicks the door down. Justice doesn't always come with sirens and flashing lights. Not the kind that sticks, not the kind that matters. Real justice is quieter, more deliberate, and when it strikes, it shakes the ground because it's built on truth. And that's exactly how I approached what came next. I didn't come roaring into Karen's world with my badge held high and handcuffs swinging. I came in with patience, documentation, and precision, knowing that her arrogance would be her downfall. The moment I returned home with that USB, full of footage and hours of testimony from neighbors who were finally brave enough to speak up, I contacted the district attorney's office and scheduled a private meeting. I didn't want gossip. I wanted a strategy. I sat across from Assistant DA Melanie Brooks, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd worked with on 2 major cases before, and laid out everything. Video, voice recordings, HOA emails, patterned fines, witness accounts, medical documentation of Emma's injuries. I spoke calmly but with fire behind every word. When I showed her the footage of Karen snapping my daughter's crutch and calling her limp girl in that private office chat, Melanie went stone silent for a full 10 seconds before exhaling and saying, "We're opening an investigation immediately." That was the first domino. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked quietly, meticulously, gathering everything I could. I spoke with parents, reviewed HOA meeting minutes, obtained copies of Karen's correspondence with the city, and even reached out to a civil rights attorney who specialized in ADA violations. What we discovered was staggering. Fines disproportionately issued to families with children who had disabilities or behavioral differences, selective enforcement of rules targeting immigrants and single mothers, and a secret HOA fund used for community upgrades that somehow always ended up at Karen's property. Her fence, her landscaping, her new mailbox. She had built a small empire off fear and silence, and for years, no one thought they had the power to challenge her. Until now. When the next HOA board meeting was scheduled, I made sure it was marked on every calendar in the neighborhood. I didn't say a word about what was coming. I let Karen think she still ruled, still walked on her little throne of laminated bylaws and petty complaints. That night, as the sun began to set and the clubhouse filled with families, some curious, some anxious, all waiting, I put on my full sheriff's uniform for the first time in months, badge gleaming, holster strapped. I looked in the mirror before leaving the house and kissed my daughter on the forehead. "This is for you, baby," I whispered, and she nodded, her new temporary crutches leaning beside her like sentries. When I stepped into that meeting, the room didn't just freeze. It shifted. People stopped breathing for a second. Karen was at the head of the long, folding table, surrounded by her usual loyalists, flipping through papers and issuing another ridiculous fine for someone's non-compliant mailbox, when she looked up and saw me, in uniform, with a thick manila folder in hand. I walked forward slowly, deliberately, and placed it right in front of her with a calm that must have chilled her to the bone. "Karen," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade, "I'm here on official business." She blinked rapidly, her mouth twitching. "Excuse me? Is there some kind of mistake?" I opened the folder and tapped the top document, a signed warrant to seize HOA records for investigation. "You're under investigation for targeted harassment, destruction of property, abuse of authority, and multiple violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act," I said, letting the words hang in the air like thunder. "These are not neighborhood complaints. These are legal charges." One of the board members, a man who had always nodded along to her every word, stood up abruptly. "We didn't know about any of this." I cut him off. "You all played a part, but Karen, you led the charge." The air grew thick, with murmurs and gasps. I saw parents nodding, people exchanging glances, a few even recording on their phones. Karen's face drained of color, her fake tan suddenly looking even more artificial under the fluorescent lights. "You can't be serious," she sputtered, standing so quickly her chair scraped across the tile. "I have the right to enforce community." "No," I interrupted firmly. "You abused your position. You bullied children. You destroyed the medical equipment of a disabled child. You used your authority not to build a community, but to control it through fear. And now you will answer for it." Right on cue, the Clubhouse doors opened again, and 2 uniformed deputies walked in. Her eyes bulged. "You're arresting me? In front of everyone?" "I'm not just arresting you," I said, stepping back and nodding to my team. "I'm pressing the charges myself." As they read her rights and clicked the cuffs around her wrists, Karen looked around the room. Not for help, but for loyalty. She found none. The very people she had intimidated for years now looked at her with something between pity and satisfaction. No one stopped them. No one objected. And as she was escorted out, heels clicking on tile, her precious, board meeting silenced behind her, it wasn't just her power being stripped, it was her identity. Outside, local press who had gotten wind of the investigation snapped photos as she was led to the squad car. I stood at the door and didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The law had spoken. But what happened afterward, that's what really broke me. Not with sadness, but with something overwhelming and pure. A week after the arrest, the school held a small assembly to honor participants of the parade. Emma hadn't expected much. She was still recovering emotionally, even if she tried to hide it behind her brave smile. But as we sat in the auditorium, the principal stepped forward and cleared his throat. "We have a very special announcement," he said. "Next year's parade will be led by a student who showed us all what courage looks like. Someone who stood tall even when knocked down." "Emma, would you come up here, please?" The room erupted in applause. Emma looked at me, shocked, and I nodded, helping her to her feet. She walked to the stage slowly, her balance still a work in progress, but every step was filled with pride. Then came the real surprise. From behind the curtain, 2 students wheeled out a box, and when they opened it, inside was a brand new pair of crutches. Not ordinary ones. These were custom-built, gleaming gold-plated metal with padded black grips and sparkling pink detail. On each side, engraved in perfect lettering, were the words, "Sheriff's Daughter." I felt tears sting my eyes as Emma ran her fingers along the engraving and then looked out at the crowd, beaming, not just from joy, but from strength. She hadn't just survived, she had become a symbol. The community had rallied behind her. The HOA had voted to remove Karen and rewrite several of the outdated bylaws. Complaints were now handled by a neutral third party. And most importantly, neighbors began talking to each other again, not in fear, but in friendship. As I stood there, watching my daughter finally get the moment of honor she deserved, I realized something I hadn't let myself believe until that very second. We had won. Not just in court, not just in the press, but in spirit. Karen thought she had the power to break us, but she didn't understand that when you come for someone's child, especially a child who has fought every day of her life just to walk, you don't just pick a fight. You declare war. And in that war, I came prepared. With truth. With community. With the badge I never wanted to use in my own neighborhood, until I had to. And when I did, it meant something. Because justice, when done right, doesn't need noise. It just needs to be done. A year had passed since the moment Karen's cruel hand reached out and snapped not just a crutch, but the dignity of a child, my child, in front of the whole town. And yet, standing on the edge of this year's school parade, the memory felt both impossibly distant and vividly near, like an echo that never quite faded but no longer defined the present. The sun was brighter this time, not just in the sky, but in the hearts of the people gathered. Lawn chairs lined the streets not as silent judgments, but as seats of celebration. Neighbors brought lemonade, kids waved homemade flags, and people actually talked to each other, smiled, laughed, asked about each other's families. There was no fear of someone snapping a photo of your garage door paint or reporting your garden gnome. The cloud Karen had cast over the neighborhood had lifted, not easily, not instantly, but in the deliberate healing way that communities can mend when truth leads the way. And at the center of this new dawn was my daughter, Emma. She stood at the front of the parade route, her golden crutches glinting in the morning light, her new braces polished and firm, her little hands steady on the grips. She wasn't hiding behind the crowd or waiting for someone to tell her where to go. She was leading, not because she had to prove herself, but because she had nothing left to prove. Her journey, her pain, her perseverance had already said everything. This parade wasn't about disability or pity anymore. It was about strength, about transformation, about a girl who once fell in front of the crowd and now walked with her head high through it. Behind her walked classmates, teachers, neighbors, and right behind them was me, in uniform again, not out of duty but pride. My badge sat on my chest, not as a symbol of law, but as a reminder of the quiet war we had fought and won, not just for justice, but for dignity, for community, for a future where people like Karen never held unchecked power again. Karen, of course, was long gone. Her arrest had made the local papers and even a few national blogs. After facing charges for destruction of property, harassment, discrimination, and multiple counts of civil rights violations, she took a plea deal that barred her from holding any position of public or private authority over a residential group, again. Fines followed. So did mandatory sensitivity training. But the real sentence was public knowledge, exposure. Once the town knew who she really was, the whispers she used to spread behind fences turned into a silence louder than judgment. She moved out within 3 months, tail tucked, leaving behind a beige house stripped of all its forced perfection. In her place, a new HOA board rose, one built on transparency, fairness, and actual service to the neighborhood. They got rid of the rulebook Karen had weaponized. They created a community garden. They stopped fining families for sidewalk chalk drawings and instead hosted chalk art contests. The transformation was subtle at first, but now, a year later, it felt complete. Our neighborhood had remembered how to breathe. And that morning, as I watched Emma take her first steps forward on that route, this time by her own choice, at her own pace, I realized something that made my throat tighten and my heart swell all at once. This wasn't just a victory for our family. It was a redemption story for everyone who had been afraid to speak up, everyone who had swallowed injustice for the sake of peace. The crowd clapped not out of obligation, but out of admiration. People held signs that read, "Emma Strong," and "Our Real Parade Leader." Some had even decorated their dogs to match Emma's crutches, pink and gold bows tied to collars, as if to say, "We walk with you." I saw old Mr. Harland, the widower who Karen once fined for hanging a wind chime in memory of his wife, standing beside a little boy with autism who now giggled freely in the noise without fear of a noise. Complaint. They high-fived each other like old friends. I saw mothers who used to avoid HOA meetings now exchanging recipes and planning block parties. I saw a town not just watching a parade, but becoming one. I don't know when it hit me exactly, but somewhere along that route, with the smell of cotton candy in the air and the sound of my daughter's determined steps tapping rhythmically. On the pavement, I realized that justice wasn't just about punishing the wrong, it was about restoring the right. It was about healing the unseen wounds, the tension in the shoulders when you check your mailbox and wonder if today's the day Karen found something else to complain about, the guilt parents carried for letting their kids be anything other than compliant, the silence that kept so many good people from speaking truth to power. That silence was broken now, and in its place stood cheers, and music, and crutches that gleamed like medals of honor. At the end of the parade route, the school set up a small stage. A banner hung overhead that read, "Leadership is not power, it's compassion." Emma was invited to speak, just a short thanks. You? Nothing formal. She stepped up, adjusted the mic with her small fingers, and looked out at the crowd with eyes far too wise for her age. She didn't read from a paper. She didn't stutter or hesitate. She just said, "Thank you for seeing me, not for what I can't do, but for what I do anyway." And that was it. But it was enough to make grown men cry. I had to turn away for a second to wipe my eyes, pretending to look at my badge, but in truth I was looking at her, my daughter, my light, my quiet warrior, who had taught this entire town how to walk again. After the parade, people stayed. They didn't rush home like before. They shared ice cream. They helped each other clean up. Someone even set up a speaker and played music while kids danced barefoot in the grass. There were no rules posted, no clipboards, no warnings, just life, community, connection. As the sun began to set and the gold in Emma's crutches caught, the last light of day, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, this is what home is supposed to feel like." And she was right. It wasn't about houses or fences or regulations. It was about belonging, about safety, about knowing the people. Around you would stand up when it mattered, even if it took a sheriff's badge, a courtroom, and a parade to remember how. I took her hand, and we walked the path one more time together, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. Because in this town now, everyone walks beside each other. Not above, not below, side by side. And in that moment, under a sky, streaked with orange and purple and hope, I knew this wasn't just a story of revenge or justice. It was a story of redemption. And this parade, it wasn't just an event anymore. It was our victory march, one that would echo in this town for generations to come. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the HOA Stories for more real-life tales of justice, drama, and redemption. Have you ever dealt with an out-of-control HOA or a neighborhood bully like Karen? Tell us your story in the comments. We might just feature it in a future episode. And remember, when the rules are used to hurt, it's time to rewrite them. Join the fight one story at a time, right here on the HOA Stories.